if you're aware of that, that's great. And welcome to the Performance and Overview Scrutiny Committee of Tuesday the 14th of May 2024. My name is Alistair Neil, Councillor Alistair Neil, and I chair the committee with committee members in the chamber as well as online. And I would ask you, please, to, at the first time that you speak, to introduce yourself, and similarly to for any officer who is in attendance. And I'm pleased to say that we have both Cabinet member and senior officer in attendance for the initial two reports at this stage. So we'll take, first of all, apologies for absence, and I know that we've got Councillor Fuchs has been unable to attend, and thank you, Councillor McConnell, for stepping in at relatively short notice. That's appreciated. We've got Councillor Wright, who's unable to attend, and I'm not sure about Councillor Bond, but I've not knowingly received any message, but I don't see her. Okay. We'll confirm if she's unable to attend. However, we have plenty of good questions, I'm sure, going to follow from the committee members. Moving on to declarations of interest, if there are any. I don't see any, so we will move on to item 3, which is the public open forum. And just to say for any member of the public who's watching it, this time or at a future point, as with all scrutiny meetings, it's live streamed and recorded. And if you would like to share your thoughts on any report or proposals being discussed by the Scrutiny Committee, you'll find a form in which to do this on our agenda page in the website. So do please feel free to do so. We'd be very interested in your views. We'll move on to item 4 on the agenda, and the first of 3 main reports. This one is the additional learning provision, specialist resource bases, a scrutiny of those of this report. And I welcome Councillor Martin Grockett, Cabinet Member, as well as Dr. Marwena Wagstaff, the Head of Inclusion, and thank you for being here to take us through the key points from the report, which we will then follow with some questions. I don't know which of you would like to start, but Councillor Grockett, would you be willing to just say a few words, and then we'll move across to Dr. Marwena Wagstaff. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members. All I'd like to say really is that I think one of the interesting things about these first 2 items on the agenda this morning are that they, in a sense, reflect the interface between the political and the educational, because they reflect a change in philosophy from previous administrations in Monmouthshire. And by that I mean that we have moved on from the idea that children with very specialist needs could have those needs best met by sending them away to specialist schools that often were many miles away, that had no links with families and communities and so on. I suppose the political bit is that vision of the best way to educate the young people of Monmouthshire has changed. And I think the vision is now that young people should be in there with their families, with their communities, and with their peers. And so it's about how you provide the resources to shift from the one view of education to another. It's a journey that we are on, and I'm delighted that we've created and established a team of very skilled officers and practitioners that are enabling us to drive forward with that different view of the best way to provide education for young people who sometimes have very challenging and very demanding additional learning needs. So having said that as a context, I think I'm going to hand over to the real expert in this.
Councillor Groker, just before you do, you've made a couple of interesting observations. So have you therefore closed some specialist facilities in order to make what you've described as this very significant change?
In the last administration, the last remaining special school in Monmouthshire was closed. That was Mountain House, which was specialist secondary provision for young people with challenging behaviour.
But Councillor Groker, your comments...
That was in the last authority. We have not closed any special schools, and we now have no special schools.
But Councillor Groker, your opening comments talked about a major change that this administration is taking, moving away from specialist provision to locating young people with particular learning needs in otherwise conventional schooling. So I'm just trying to understand what that means, because it's what you're now clarifying is that you haven't closed any specialist schools, and therefore this is just a continuation, is it not?
I think what the point I was trying to make, and clearly unsuccessfully, was that at one time we sent young people many miles away out of county to residential provision elsewhere in the country. We have now switched that model to one where we would never say that we would never use provision out of county, because there will always be occasions where some youngsters will have additional needs that are so profound that they will need very, very specialist help and support. But in the vast majority of cases, where in the past we might have sent children to anywhere in the country, we are now enabling them to be educated effectively within their local communities. And that's the point I was making. Well, not that we have closed our own special schools.
Okay, Councillor Groker, thank you. I really don't want to have any abiding confusion on this, because your opening remarks were political, and this is not a political meeting. And you very clearly appeared to be saying that you had made a major change in the approach from the previous administration. So what you've just clarified is that there is not a major change from the previous administration, that the provision of learning in specialist resource basis continues as it was at the end of the last administration, unless you have something else to say on that. I think that's the way we will understand the current situation. And move on to Dr. Merwina Wagstaff to take us through the report, please.
Good morning, everybody. As I've been introduced, I'm Morwenna Wagstaff. I'm Head of Service for Inclusion in Monmouthshire, and I've been in post about 18 months now. So thank you for the opportunity this morning to report to you all about our additional learning provision, or our ALP, review of our specialist resource bases in line with the expectations of the new ALN legislation and code. We want to provide some update on the progress since the review and sort of the recommendations and how they're moving forward. So Monmouthshire doesn't have a discrete special school, but we've developed a model of specialist provision which puts special education at the heart of a number of our mainstream schools. And the idea around that, which has been highlighted, is about keeping as many young people and children as possible close to their communities and in Monmouthshire. We've made use of ALN and capital grant funding over recent years to improve physical environments, resources and training of our SRB staff, as well as increasing the staffing numbers in correlation to the pupil numbers. This has resulted in our SRBs now being able to meet the needs of children and young people with more complex additional learning needs. We currently have three primary SRBs and 2 secondary SRBs, all of which provide ALP, so additional learning provision, for children and young people with highly complex learning and neurodevelopmental needs. We also are in the exciting position that we have the new SRB provision within the 3 to 19 school in Abergavenny, and we've progressed recently with some key appointments of lead staff for that base. So the ALP review, the additional learning provision review, and the associated quality assurance cycle with that is to ensure that there is a consistent approach to meeting the needs of children and young people with complex ALN in Monmouthshire. And we completed the review actually during the last academic year. Overall outcomes from the review, and I won't go through them all because I know that you've all had sight of the report, and there's more details in the appendices, but some overall outcomes were that there were examples of high quality, innovative documentation and SRB specific policies and procedures. All our SRBs are led by skilled and experienced lead teachers, and nearly all SRB lead teachers were either on or linked to the host school's senior leadership teams, and the relationships between pupils and staff were positive. Overall recommendations included, and again, I won't go through them all, but it highlighted some of the lack of consistency across our SRBs, which obviously can pose a risk in the future should confidence of parents and carers with one particular setting, or if the lack of consistency is noted, that provides us with a risk. The ALP review highlighted the need, or the lack of at the moment, but the need for a more formalised contract, a partnership agreement between the host schools and the local authority, which would then ensure that those roles and responsibilities moving forward on both sides were in place and secure to ensure the high quality SRB provision going forward. And then the other thing that was highlighted, I'm just picking one out, was that there was a variability in terms of the kind of finances and the accountability during the ALP review. So the ALP review and sort of subsequent further changes and developments within ALN led to the development of a new role within the service, and that is of the additional learning provision and partnership lead role. And unfortunately, Hayley Page, who has been seconded into that role from September 2023, is stuck on the M4 at the moment with a flat tyre. So I'm doing the whole bit. But so that is a 2-year seconded post. And the focus is around SRB development, quality assurance of ALN and ALP, so additional learning provision, the implementation of the ALN Act, and also developing a post-16 ALN strategy. Since Hayley's appointment and work from September, she's worked with all of the SRBs in line with the findings and recommendations of our review to develop clear action plans with the lead teachers, and all of these highlight areas requiring development. These are revisited regularly and reviewed depending on the level of support required, and we have highlighted a couple of key priority areas, which include the development of appropriate staffing structures in line with agreed ratios, improving the environment and ensuring a total communication approach, which is a way to ensure that children who are non-speaking have the opportunity to use communication throughout their day. The SRBs have all engaged and continue to engage really positively with the processes and are really enthusiastic with working with us to drive continuous improvement for all the children and young people, both currently in their settings, but those that will be coming to them. And since the SRB review, I'll just highlight a few of the key developments since that time. So we've reviewed and revised staff structure to ensure parity across the SRBs through increased staffing budget. We've developed an approach to pupil-led funding with clear criteria and referral routes. We've identified projections for the next 7 years of SRB entry. We've collectively created some shared policies, for example, around intimate care, relationships and behaviour, and curriculum and assessment. We've developed a shared training plan that now sits across all of our SRBs, so we can develop. So we can offer core, advanced and specialist training for our specialist teaching staff in the bases. We've developed a train-the-trainer model for certain areas which we were reliant on external trainers coming in, and they include at the moment manual handling and team teach, which is a positive handling approach to for children who present with behaviours of concern or challenge. And we've also developed a task and finish group who've pulled together job descriptions, person specifications, and interview processes and questions to allow for a more consistent approach to the recruitment of staff to the SRBs. Just to highlight a real risk for us, the numbers of children and young people with complex ALN is increasing, and that is putting a greater demand on specialist placements both in Monmouthshire but nationally. The regional South East Wales special schools, which we have often relied on to provide some of this ALP, additional learning provision, are at full capacity. And our alternative options are independent specialist provisions, which are very costly. We have already extended our SRB places, our provision, and obviously that includes the King Henry 3 to 19 SRB provision, which will have 55 places in secondary and 8 in primary, in addition to the class that already exists. But we do forecast that we will predict that we will need an increase in number of SRB places. So therefore, in the future, we're going to need to think about how we can expand the model to meet the need that we know is coming through our early year settings and schools currently. So I've whistle-stop through my report, and I would welcome any questions there might be.
Thank you, Marwena. That's very helpful to have taken us through the key points from the report. We assume that committee members have read the report. It's very interesting and very comprehensive. And before we move into questions, I'll be asking colleagues for your questions or comments in a second. It's just to make the point that whilst we may well have questions about specific aspects, that we would want to feed back to everybody involved in the provision of support, of ALN support, and everybody involved in it, including the young people who attend the classes, that we are immensely supportive, that we can see just a huge amount of great work that is done and how important that is. And please don't misunderstand if we're asking questions about the report and comments that come out of it, anything other than that as a starting point. We're extremely supportive of what is an incredibly important provision for young people, and thank every member of staff involved in the work that is provided. I'll ask, if I may, committee members, if you have any questions, to raise your hand, and we will start with Peter Strong. Councillor Strong, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the report. It's obviously been a very large piece of work done here. You made reference when you were speaking to us just now to a lack of consistency, and that does appear at several stages in the report. A reference, for example, that nearly all SRBs have appropriately developed curriculum. Nearly all is another way of saying not all, isn't it? I wondered if you could perhaps drill down a bit into the nature of the inconsistencies. Was it mainly within one or two bases or more? Yeah. And my second question, if I could just ask two at once. This was very much an internal report. It would be interesting to compare the report we got here with anything that we get from Estin. I've no reason to believe that an Estin report would be more accurate than the internal one. I sometimes suspect the reverse, to be honest. But it would be interesting to make a comparison, and I'm just wondering what we're expecting from Estin over the coming 12 months before we hear back from you in a year's time, which is scheduled. And in particular, will Estin just inspect school by school, or will they do like you've done, which would be a more appropriate approach maybe, and look at all SRBs in the round to get that sort of comparison that you've been striving for in your report? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Strong. And Marwena.
Shall I take the first part, Will, and then hand over to you for the second part? So thank you for your question, Councillor Strong. Absolutely. So in terms of the lack of consistency that was identified through the review, I guess historically, because the bases were linked to individual schools, they kind of developed under their own personality, and that obviously is a great benefit to the bases, is that to the children who attend our bases are also attending the wider school as well, and that's really important to both the children at the bases, but their families, and also the mainstream schools of which the bases are attended, so the children have that sense of identity. But as a result, it has meant that because there wasn't always that kind of overarching umbrella, I like to think of it, across all of our SRBs, just developments of different inconsistencies happened. So one of the ways that we address that, and actually that's been happening for a number of years, it was during COVID, we developed what we call the SPOT network, which is the Specialist Provision and Outreach Team network, and that is all of the lead teachers across all of the SRB bases and LA officers, educational psychology, ALN teams, for example. And there has been that drive to ensure that consistency for a number of years now. And I think what we highlighted through the review, which was our first opportunity to go in and kind of look around a bit more detail and do a really rigorous sort of visit, was that there were pockets of really excellent practice. And to pick up on another point, we have got an Estin case study for one of our SRBs. And I want to say within the last 12 months, we'll be able to give you more of the detail. But And it was just to highlight those inconsistencies, because what we don't want is kind of, a postcode lottery that we've got, an excellent one here and not so excellent. We want to really bring them all up to the same standard. So that is across the board. So there are pockets of, really good practice, excellent practice in some of our bases, and not so strong in others. And we're using that sort of SPOT network and this process of coming together much more as a tighter network of specialist provision for Monmouthshire as to raise all of those standards. So there's been loads of sharing of good practice, sharing of policies, a lot more consistency now across policies. So they would look very similar across different schools in some of those areas, but there's always more work to be done, and it's about just trying to sort of manage that so that parental confidence and expectation can be, strong into the future, really. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Councillor Strong, did that answer your question? And I'll ask Will.
Yes, I think so. It's interesting that you make the point that the SRBs might well reflect the personality, I think your term, of the school. That will continue, though, won't it? I think, and it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's within certain limits. Because after all, some of those children in the SRBs will have brothers and sisters in the mainstream, and if we're going to have inclusion, it's also inclusion of a personality. Yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, that came out when we met with the head teachers to report on the review in the early days. That came out really strongly, how important the SRBs were to the school and how important that sense of identity. We didn't want to get to the point where the SRBs felt separate to the school. They wear the uniform, and as you say, siblings go to the school, and families want their children to go to their local schools. So, yeah, that's really important, and we're definitely not about getting rid of that personality. It's just making sure kind of the core, the foundation is of high quality across the board. That's what we're aiming for.
That's really good to hear. In terms of that integration, it sounds like an extremely important thing that is, I'm sure, taking time to develop, but very important we maintain it. I was going to ask the second question, if Will McLean, the director, could address that one. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Will McLean, Chief Officer for Children and Young People, Monmouthshire. Thank you for the question, Councillor Strong. So with regards to the differential between the evaluation that you see in front of you today undertaken by the team and Estin, I think Estin look for in all the providers a really honest and robust self-evaluation, and I hope all members who've had the chance to look at the report today will agree that this is exactly that, a really honest reflection of where we are across our special resource bases right across Monmouthshire. It doesn't hide away from the fact that there is work to do in some of those to ensure that the very high levels of provision we see in some bases is echoed right across the piece, and that's differentiated in different areas. So it's not to say that there isn't, that there's one base which is in particular position and others. That mixture of provision exists everywhere, and there's always things to learn in terms of how those different bases do it. In terms of what our expectations are from Estin have been very interested in our ALN work for a long time now. So unlike schools who have a visit every 6 years, we have a visit every term from Estin as part of our local authority link inspector roles. For the past few visits, our link inspector has met with Morwenna and other members of the team. In fact, spent a whole day with the team working through our processes and procedures around how we support learners with additional learning needs. We are part of the National Thematic Review on ALM provision, and we are currently preparing for another visit from Estin on the 2nd of July, which Morwenna and colleagues will again present back to them the questions that they've asked about our provision and the nature of our provision. And also, of course, Estin will be watching this morning for the commentary that we offer and the commentary that you offer back to us. In terms of the inspection piece, when at that point in the future the local authority is re-inspected, ALN will be a focus of that because it was a recommendation from our last inspection, so you would fully expect that to be the case. But the SRBs will be part of a local inspection, so they're not inspected separately. If a school has an SRB, the inspectors will visit. The extent to which they express a view on it will be determined by the findings of their broader school visit. Although, as Morwenna has said, Monmouth Comprehensive had a case study identified around their provision for inclusive learning through the SRB, which I think was hugely positive, and our other secondary SRB was visited as part of the thematic review that Estin undertook last time, and that was undertaken by both a peer and an Estin lead. So lots of coverage by Estin of our work, and we continue to work with them to give them the assurances that they need around the provision that we provide.
Thank you, Will. That's very reassuring. Can I just check that I heard accurately what you were describing in terms of the lead inspector? Did you say 1 day every 10 years that they would spend with the team, or did I misunderstand that? One whole day you mentioned the lead inspector.
So no, so they visit every term for a day, and we had a special whole day visit from Andrea to visit the ALN team outside of our normal engagement cycle to meet with the team and to work all the way through all the paperwork and all the processes and everything that we have in place. So it's significantly more than once every 10 years. I might look a little more relaxed if it was, but...
It's why I was asking. I heard term as 10, as simple as that, so thank you for clarifying that. And I'm going to ask Councillor Buckler, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Rachel Buckler, Member for Devorden. Good morning, and thank you very much for your report, Morwenna. It was fascinating. And there are several things that sort of came out to me. There's a concern about rising numbers of pupils requiring complex ALN provision. Can you explain why this is? It might be supposition, but obviously this is a sort of growing problem as far as you and your department are concerned. And what would you like to achieve from the partnership agreements between the local authority and host schools? It sort of sounds as though this is a new departure. I'm quite surprised to hear that there isn't more of a connection, but perhaps you can explain. Has always been a connection, but it's being strengthened, but that would be useful. And the third point I'd like to make is regarding capacity for pupils who need these additional learning provisions, particularly for Pembroke Primary School, which has a 24 pupil capacity, but there are 29 on the roll as of September 24, and Monmouth Comprehensive capacity, which is 55. But as of September 24 and from September 23, there have been 67 pupils who need this provision. What effect, which I can only imagine it does have an impact on all the pupils who need this service, what effect is it having? What can be done to mitigate it or solve the problem? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler, and Marwena.
Thank you for your questions, Councillor Buckler. So I'll try and pick them off one at a time, but do let me know if I've missed something. So in terms of rising numbers, I could have a guess. I'm a psychologist. I've been in the psychology service for a number of years in Monmouthshire and a psychologist for a number of years. There are rising numbers of children with complex ALN nationally. Lots of reasons. One being the survival rate of very young children, premature babies. That's one reason. That's not the only reason. Definitely increased numbers of children with neurodiversity, neurodevelopmental needs, in particular autism. And of those, we have lots of children, autistic children, young people in our schools, in our mainstream schools, the vast majority of them. But the children who end up in our SRBs are those with the most complex needs, so very often are non-speaking and have other additional sensory, physical or medical needs as well as the learning difficulties. So I don't know the true answer. I think there's many people out there who are still exploring, but I think it's very multifaceted, and the trend is a rise, and what we're now able to do in Monmouthshire with some confidence is, because our early years model is really strong, is identify them as early as possible, which is not, it's not an exact science, because obviously children in those early years their developmental trajectory can surprise us, which is fantastic, but we can have a really good idea of children who are likely to need that provision going forward, and we're trying to be far more robust in our tracking of children through our educational system. So even if they begin school, which is very often the case within mainstream provision, we are now minded to the fact that as they move through those transitions, they may need something more specialist. So we're trying to respond to that need. Particularly the transition from primary to secondary is a significant jump for children who may have been supported in mainstream. So I hope that answers your kind of first question. Your second question around that kind of partnership agreement, again, historically the bases have been hosted in those schools for a number of years, and it is, it's been successful. That's where the position we're in now. I think what we feel very strongly now is because they are very much our specialist provision, they're the equivalent of our special schools, and all of the children in those provisions have statutory plans, so mostly now, because we've almost implemented ALN, IDPs. We have an obligation as a local authority to provide high quality provision for those. We have absolute support and enthusiasm from our current head teachers in all of those host schools, and they work really closely with us. But the partnership agreement is about ensuring that into the future, regardless of whether you get a new head teacher. As an example would be, you get a new head teacher into one of the schools, and actually they don't, we want them to agree and see what the provision, the provisions, although they are hosted by the mainstream schools, are local authority provisions. We fund them, we place the children there, we make those decisions. So it's about us ensuring the sustainability of that going forward and the high quality. So the partnership agreements, they're in draft at the moment. We're hoping to consult with our head teachers this term. So we are hoping that they'll be in place for the next academic year. They've been developed alongside our SRB leads, and it is just ensuring those roles and responsibilities on both sides, so both as local authority officers, but also from the host school's position, that they know what the deal is really in terms of, support that they will get, admissions, funding, expectations from our part in terms of the, the quality of training, etc., that's going into those. So it is about formalising, I guess, something that already exists, but in a way that's hopefully going to protect our provision into the future for all the children and young people coming through. Hoping I've answered those two. So the third one, capacity, absolutely. It's a massive challenge for us at the moment. We have increased the capacity in both Monmouth and Pembroke. In terms of in Pembroke, we've developed additional classroom provision and staffing to support that. And in Monmouth, we have done that. Monmouth is less well-resourced for space, so it's really at its limit. But we're hoping that the King Henry 3 to 19 school will ease some of that pressure, because obviously there are some children who access or would access the SRB provision in the north of the county and at the moment go to Monmouth, and some of those children live in Abergavenny. So we're hoping that over time, that will help balance that situation out. But capacity capacity is going to be an issue for us going forward. We already have pressures coming through for the next few academic years, so we are trying to kind of address that. The beauty of this model is that actually we've already stood up an extra SRB, because we did that with the King Henry base, in that we've had a primary one in Derry View that is now being absorbed into the new base. So we know what works. We've got a great network of people. We've got the policies. We know how to run a base. We're supporting the development of the King Henry base. So that is an option for us in the future, is whether we need to think about having further resource bases in other parts of the county. And I guess that is the beauty of this model, rather than having to go and build a whole new school and resource that. So, yeah, I hope I've answered that question.
Thank you. And if I could just delve a little bit further into the capacity question that Councillor Buckler asked. Is the constraint around capacity a teaching constraint, or is it a physical classroom constraint, or is it something else, or a combination of these things? I'm just mindful of the additional capacity that's going on of 55 spaces at the new 3 to 19 school at King Henry. Is that, in your judgment, you're telling us about the need for more capacity, and there's already a demand of 67 numbers on the roll at Monmouth Comprehensive. Is that capacity being factored into the new school at King Henry? Is that going to be adequate?
Hopefully. Capacity, I guess it's both, really. So if I pick out the example of Pembroke, because that's an easier one, really, and it's strange how it turns out. Sometimes you have a kind of a group of children in a particular area. So a number of years ago, that was actually in the Abergavenny area, which is how we ended up standing up a primary resource space in Derry View very quickly. I think we had 6 or 7 children with really complex needs who just happened to live in that area, so we had to respond quite quickly. And that's been similar, really. The pressure was in Pembroke, just in terms of number, so we were able, because they had space within their grounds, to develop an additional classroom there, and then obviously we've provided the staffing to support those numbers. In Monmouth Comp, it has just been that demand in the north of the county. We're hoping that the Abergavenny school will obviously ease some of that, but what we're not going to be expecting children who are already in Monmouthshire SRB is to move if their parents don't want them to, if that makes sense. So that pressure, we hope, will be eased, but it's likely to be eased over time as children transition into the Abergavenny 3 to 19 SRB provision, rather than removing children from Monmouth Comp. I think we have a few who do reside in Abergavenny, so once the school is open, they could have the choice to move across. So we're trying to kind of factor that into our forecasting. We've got a projection over our numbers, which I don't have with me, for the next couple of years, which suggests that we will ease some of the pressures in Monmouth Comp as the King Henry School sort of fills up, as it were. But sometimes you have children move in from county, that's harder to predict. And in the past, we have supported a number of children out of county into our bases as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful indeed, and comprehensive too. So thanks for that. Councillor Pavia.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I didn't know. Did Councillor Buckler want to come back in? Was there anything else, or was she done?
Oh, thank you, Councillor Pavia. Actually, what I'd like to say, Morwenna, is I like the fact that you're looking at the sustainability of the services in the future. They're obviously key to what we provide as a local authority. So thank you. It was very useful hearing your explanations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Pavia.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Councillor Paul Pavia, elected member for Mount Pleasant Ward in Chepstow. Could I just thank Dr. Wagstaff for a paper. I suppose I just want to follow on from Councillor Strong's point in terms of consistency of approach and, avoiding postcode lotteries. And I suppose this is directed to this would be directed to the cabinet member, potentially chief officer as well. My understanding is that Caldecott School was issued with a warning notice last month under the School Standards Organisation Wales Act and Wales Government Statutory Guidance document schools causing for concern. A number of grounds in relation to that, but particularly grounds to, excuse me, Chair, local authority cannot be confident that children and young people placed in the specialist resource base are receiving suitable, high-quality provision. The local authority cannot be confident that the statutory additional learning needs duties as outlined in the Additional Learning Needs and Education Tribunal Act and Code are being effectively implemented and delivered, and that the governing body and the head teacher have failed to provide strategic leadership despite advice and guidance that would ensure efficient deployment of resources, which has impacted on the implementation of the Additional Learning Needs and Education Tribunals Act. So given where the review ended, is this something that's just emerged in the last year? Was this something that's developed that obviously was captured in the review but has escalated? What is the local authority doing or in terms of supporting the governing body and senior leadership team in turning this around, particularly in relation to the specialist resource base? And what are the expectations of the authority on the senior leadership team and governing body to turn that around? My second question is in relation to capacity and anticipated demand. I think Councillor Wagstaff said that you've sort of provisionally mapped numbers over the next 5 years. Is that right? Is that what you said? Yeah. Do we have sort of a lower, medium and upper indication of numbers? I'm just trying to understand the sort of demand, capacity and resource needs, and potentially going to be considerable resource needs on the authority over the next 5 years. So it's trying to understand that financial envelope. Have we sort of done that? Have we got a sort of forecasted figure for that? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Pavia. I think Will is indicating, Chief Officer, that he'd like to respond at least to the first part. Thank you.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Councillor Pavia, and thank you for your question about a letter that has remained confidential between myself and the governing body of Caldecott School, which is helpful to be played out in this setting now. You are right, though, that letter was issued, so we'll now have to understand how that letter is now in the public domain. I am able to reassure the committee, though, that the actions that were identified in that letter have been developed through significant consideration and development through professional discussions, both with ourselves and with our partners in the EAS, and represent a degree of concern that is clearly apparent, or else I wouldn't have reached the point of writing that letter. We have been working very closely with the school for an extended period of time to ensure that the provision in the school is at the standard that we want it to be, because we want it to be the very best standard for the learners who are in that school. So we've been working closely with them. In fact, probably Morwenna and I were with the school this time last year talking about the provision, and the school has made developments in that area, I think it would be fair to say. Have they been at the pace which we would wish them to see? Probably not at the moment, but in a series of really positive messages and engagements with the governing body, we've been able to have a higher degree of comfort. And I know if Hayley Page was here today, she would be able to talk very clearly about the work that she's been doing with the leadership of the SRB in the school to actually undertake that work. So, committee, I hope, can be reassured that the letter signifies the level of concern that we have, but hopefully the committee will also sense my frustration in the way in that's been shared this morning, really. So we will continue to work closely with the school to endeavour to make sure that that those changes are there. In fact, I met with the governing body last night to talk about that. They have a link governor who's working really closely, and we'll see how the progress goes. And that is part of the warning notices process, as I'm sure members are aware, that this close engagement will eventually reach the point at which we sign it off and the warning notice falls away. So I probably don't have anything else to say on that. I know Morwenna will want to add comments about the mapping and the identification of early need.
Yeah, the issue of capacity and low, medium, high, Yeah,
absolutely. So, and I have alluded to Hayley Page not being available, and unfortunately she would sit across those numbers. Yeah, we've done a forecasting piece for actually the next 7 years, which maps, and obviously it's not, as I said before, an exact science, because parental preference or parent-carer preference comes into play about whether or not a child who has complex ALN wants an SRB place. Obviously, some parents choose for their children to remain in in mainstream. And also, the early years data is only as good as it can be, because depending on the time at which we engage with our early years children and their families. But yeah, there has been a forecast, and actually Hayley's worked it through over the next 7 years and mapped it across our clusters. So we have an idea, and we do know, and I was just looking for the part in the report, that there will be a demand in the coming years. I think in particularly, yeah, we have some pressure at primary level in the south of the county, and I know that Councillor Buckler referred to Pembroke previously. You know, we've already increased the capacity there, and we need to think strategically about whether that's where we continue to increase capacity or whether we explore another option. In terms of the financial implications, we've started to do some of that, but I haven't got those detailed plans across. But that is an action that I can take from today's meeting and perhaps can bring back when we come back, is that kind of, I like, you know, that idea about that sort of low, medium, high thresholds, because and I think I've highlighted really honestly in the report, it is going to require investment going forward. The alternative to that is very expensive out of county placements for some of these children, which obviously is not then a sustainable local inclusive model. So yeah, I'll absolutely explore that in more detail and try and bring it back to you.
Thank you. And Councillor Pavio, was there any quick point you wanted to follow up on?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I appreciate the Chief Officer's potential frustration, but we need to be open and transparent about this. It's about our children's education. These are some of the most vulnerable children in our care. We need to be doing the very best. You know, you spoke about the self-evaluation process in terms of each school being open and transparent, and that the leadership know where their school is. We shouldn't be shying away from understanding the challenges in relation to our schools, and we should be supporting them to turn that and helping them to turn that around. I've got some reassurance from the Chief Officer this morning that that is in place, and they are supporting the school quite robustly, which I'm satisfied with. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to make sure we just keep to the report itself. And
sorry, Chair, can I come back on that?
Yes, please. But we could just not get into a to and fro in this, because I want to really focus on this report.
Absolutely. I think the point around self-evaluation, the fact that we undertook the self-evaluation allowed us to understand the extent of the issues. So it'd be really clear that those issues were understood and noted through the report and have been continued to be supported by the team working very closely with the school. I won't say any more on the matter.
Thank you, Will. And thanks for that clarification too. So we'll move on to Councillor Howells, and I think you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Wagstaff, for bringing this to review. My questions are really, again, with capacity, but I think we've covered that enough now. I note that in the review, you've mentioned recommendations for the SRB leads to collaborate and produce one version of a core documentation. And I just wondered if there was any update on that collaboration taking place, whether that's under a process, and whether it would be one, policy for primary level and one for secondary. The other question is just a small one, really. When I start reading the review, it kind of draws straight into the catering arrangement in the schools, and that we're not providing special catering. I kind of read that as a negative straight away. I think, well, why aren't we providing that? I just wonder whether that would be better worded in that we are, sort of integrating our food or our catering with the rest of the schools, which is a good thing, obviously. I just wonder if there was a reason for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Howes. And Marina, yes, thanks.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Howells. In terms of the recommendations around collaboration in particular, yeah, I would say, and hopefully that is evidenced through the report, we have a greater understanding of collaboration in terms of developing shared policies and procedures around a number of things. And examples I know already exist or existed when I wrote this report were intimate care, behaviour and relationships, curriculum and assessment. So we are developing, and yes, you're right, there is a difference between secondary and primary, particularly around curriculum and assessment. The curriculum for Wales has been obviously in our primary schools for a number of years and is actually now, I think, at year 8 rollout in our secondary schools. So that has required a complete redesign of our curriculum model for the SRBs, particularly in secondary. So that is being done very much as a group. I mentioned the specialist provision and outreach team group of collaboration between the SRB leads in particular. And yes, they increasingly, which is really wonderful to see, work really well together. They are peers and will come and sit along and share good practice. So yes, we don't have a one Monmouthshire policy with a Monmouthshire title on the top, but what we have is a core policy in all those areas that then a school adopts and makes their own. So there would be a similarity. And I think we're working through kind of prospectus, SRB prospectus and things at the moment. And again, if Hayley was here, I know that she could give you more detail of the focus of those policies and procedures. But as you can imagine, there's a whole raft of policies and procedures in schools, and all of those with the SRB in mind will be looked at through this cycle of kind of collaboration, formal collaboration around those things. And obviously our challenge is having a 3 to 19 school is looking at how the primary and secondary, you know, how we work through that whole phase, which will be really interesting as well. In terms of catering, I'm not sure, I don't know if that was mentioned in the report, and if it was, I've sort of missed it. The details of catering, I don't know where that question has come from, and my apologies. It
may be a question that is best looked at outside the meeting, as the emphasis being on integration of catering, as opposed to the suggestion that they're not catered for.
Okay.
You know, that's, I think, Councillor Howell's point there.
That's it. Yeah. It was just a wording, really. It's not really relevant in the overview of the review. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Dr. Wexler. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Howes. And I was just going to, in our pre-meet, Councillor Buckler, you may have had an additional question that you were holding back until later. I'm just really mopping up to see if there's anything that you still had that you hadn't asked, or if I had them covered.
Thank you, Chair. Very kind of you. Yes, so what I'd like to know, actually, is what is meant by the variability in finances and accountability. Bit of a sweeping statement, but what does it actually mean for the schools and the services that we provide? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler. I think, as Mr. McLean has said earlier, I think the review afforded us the opportunity to go in and kind of dig about a bit more than we would have in the past. So that kind of LA funding, the SRBs, has always been the case. But because, you know, as I said earlier, because they've kind of developed in different mainstream schools at different paces with different demands in terms of numbers and capacity and staffing. It was just around our alignment of those financial arrangements for schools to ensure, for example, and a piece that we have worked on and have sort of ironed out a little bit more is, you know, to ensure that there's an agreed level of staffing ratios in our SRBs around expectations from a local authority position, and that's funded. And then we've also developed a pupil-led funding formula as well for children who require something additional too, because of some, you know, additional specific need that they have, and how to fund that in a kind of a fair way across the county to ensure that we have a kind of a robust funding model. And I think it was just acknowledgement when we did the review was actually because those things had kind of developed independently, there were slight differences and inconsistencies in how that was obviously managed in-house, because we're talking about different schools managing their finances, and ensuring that the local authority kind of offer was fair and consistent. So there's still little bits of work to be done around that in terms of, funding for resources and additional things within the bases. But yeah, it was just to kind of, be honest about there were some inconsistencies during the review that came out, but we have been working really hard on that, because obviously it is specialist provision, so there is a required, ratio of adults to children and teaching assistants and higher level teaching assistants, and obviously for some of the children they actually require personal or medical care as well. So it was just ensuring that all of that was kind of robust and strengthened, really. Does that answer your question, Councillor Buckler?
Yes, thank you very much for that. That's useful. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll move on to move the report with the recommendations. If I could just add to the points that have been made around this issue of, I think Councillor Strong mentioned it right at the outset, where the use of the terminology mainly or most SRBs were in classrooms that had high quality displays, which is great to see. They were able to support group learning, again great to see. Most had direct access to outdoor space. Most had a bespoke curriculum. It leaves the question in schools at which number 5 in total. Is there any one, or are there two, that may actually have consistent broad failings, and that in looking at this as a group, that there may be more that we need to understand in terms of a specific reassurance. So it's not the suggestion that that is the case, but by taking a group as a whole and referring to them as mostly, it does beg that question. So it would be very helpful if in the follow-up in 12 months that you might be able to just offer some clarity and reassurance that there is no school with broad and consistent failings wherever there may be terminology about most or mainly. And again, in moving the report with the recommendations, it's to request that follow-up, that you consider the questions that have arisen this morning, which, around capacity, around the growing numbers, the affordability model of this, recognising that there are two options, expensive and very expensive. Actually, your indications are very clear that this is an strong upward trend in numbers, so we'd like to see more about that. And the relationship with the local authority in terms of that, establishing consistency as well as what might be termed a contract in one form or another, to ensure best practice is moved around. So thank you, and I move the report. Oh, sorry. Yes, Will.
Sorry, Chair. Just for clarity, the language in the report is specific for a reason. So the way in which we write our evaluation reports uses a set of denominators which are the same as used by Estin. So if it'd be helpful for the committee, I'll just run through them now. So when we say most, we mean 90% or more. When we say many, we mean 70% or more. A majority is over 60%. Half or around half is close to 50%. A minority is below 40%. A few is below 20%, and very few or less than is 10%. So there's a set way in which that's done because the reader's then able to understand.
Well, that's really helpful, but my maths go only so far. 90% of 5 I'm going to struggle with in terms of mostly. So I think the point remains that it's not because there is a known concern, it's because the question arises from the terminology on looking at it as a cohort, a group, that the reassurance that there is no individual school or individual schools that have broad and consistent substantive failings. No suggestion that's the case, but it would be good to understand that in terms of a follow-up in 12 months. But thanks for that clarification. That's actually very interesting indeed to get that definition. And we'll move on, and thanking you for the questions and the points made and responses, Rowena. Marwena, I think you're probably going to stay in that seat for the next report too. And I don't know whether Dr. Lucy Doyle is also on the M4 assisting Hayley, or if she's going to join us. I'm not. She's not. So you're going to do this one again. Excellent. So thank you. We'll move on to the Supporting Vulnerable Learners report, the scrutiny of this support. And if I may just ask you to run through key points, and we'll move on to questions relating. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And absolutely, it is myself presenting this report. Dr. Lucy Doyle, who is the Principal Educational Psychologist, was unavailable today. But I was one of the Principal Educational Psychologists until fairly recently, so I feel confident that I can report or share this report that we wrote together. So I welcome the opportunity again to provide an update to members around the effectiveness of some of our approaches in supporting the needs of vulnerable learners within our schools and settings. And I wanted to draw attention really to just a couple of those approaches and pieces of work that are ongoing in our schools. So the first one is trauma-informed approaches. So trauma-informed approaches or practice is part of a universal whole school preventative approach, supporting school communities to become trauma-informed and mentally healthy places for all. Trauma-informed or relational practice is recognised by the Welsh Government throughout much of their more recent legislation and guidance, and they're highlighted in my report. By being trauma-informed or relational in our approach to children and young people, we're more able to meet the needs of vulnerable groups, and there is a recognition that, you know, it is only effective learning only occurs when children and young people are in an emotional state where they can be receptive to learning. So in Monmouthshire, since 2021, and actually prior to that, as an educational psychology service, we've always fostered a trauma-informed practice, but we utilised, from 2021, we've utilised some of the wellbeing grant that came from Welsh Government to deliver, or to have delivered, some trauma-informed schools training, and that was on different levels. So we did whole school training, senior leaders training, and a diploma in trauma-informed practice, which is a 10-day training course. We've had over 500 staff access the training, and there's a more detailed report, I know, in the links in the appendices. And the training evaluation data has been really positive, with 100% of senior leads, as an example, agreeing or strongly agreeing that the training was relevant to the needs and priorities in their schools and settings. Those training events, that training that's been ongoing for a couple of years, has led to requests for further training and for more work on whole school development and policy. So we now have a trauma-informed schools or trauma-informed practice working group that was set up last summer. And that's looking at how we can develop a more sustainable approach across Monmouthshire without having to utilise external training agencies, which is what we've used the grant for thus far. Going forward, we are continuing to use some grant money to deliver that training at this stage, but we're also looking internally at models to develop trauma-informed practice using, for example, the Educational Psychology Service, our education support team, and other professionals and LA officers from within our schools as well. And we've developed a project plan to look at how we can deliver more training in-house, and that we can create some guidance and framework for schools and settings, that we have a supervision model, because there is a supervision expectation for people who have completed the 10-day diploma to ensure that they remain at the top of their practice, and to understand and evaluate the impact of the introduction to trauma-informed practice within our schools. The second area I wanted to highlight was around the emotional literacy support assistance, and again there's a more detailed report linked to this one. But ELSA is a targeted evidence-based intervention designed to build capacity of schools to support the emotional needs of their learners from within their own resources. It's achieved through training up teaching assistants within schools to develop and deliver individualised support programmes to meet the emotional needs of children and young people within their schools and settings. ELSA's also, as well as that individualised support, offer some preventative and universal support in schools more often than not. ELSA's been in Monmouthshire since 2016, so it's well established. And although it fluctuates, we currently, in the last academic year when we counted, we had over 70 active ELSAs in our schools. And as a result of the evidence of high standards in training and supervision of ELSAs, in November 2023, we were awarded the ELSA Quality Mark as a local authority, which was a really positive development. There are some risks associated with ELSA, and one of those at the moment is with regards to ELSAs typically being teaching assistants, and obviously that is a change in workforce, and given current sort of situations in schools, those teaching assistants often, there's a rolling turnover of staff at times. Going forward, we will continue to offer initial ELSA training to teaching assistants in schools, and that ongoing supervision and CPD from the Educational Psychology Service. The third area we wanted to highlight was around the Monmouthshire Specialist Teaching Service. So this is a service that was taken over by the Educational Psychology Service in 2021. It was previously referred to as the Specific Learning Difficulties Service. A number of changes have taken place since that time, and we now feel that we have a really robust model of both individualised support for schools and an increasing model around increasing capacity through training into our schools as well. Mostly, the Monmouthshire Specialist Teaching Service is in our primary schools, and for example, last year they provided intervention to 157 pupils. There's some really good evidence about the gains that children are making in their reading and spelling, and again that's included in one of the reports. But we also provide support into King Henry VIII secondary phase through an SLA, a service level agreement, and have done for a number of years. Again, risks to this service is a slight reduction in the staffing of the team due to budget pressures, which has meant that we have now hold a small waiting list, which we are learning to manage. But again, just a real sort of just flagging up really the work that's going on in that area alongside the development of kind of literacy practice guidance and information for our schools. And finally, it was just to give a little nod to our newest kind of team. We have the education support team that was set up in April 2023 and was fully staffed from September this year. And that's a team who've been developed to support the needs of primary age children presenting with behaviours that challenge, including those with ALN, neurodevelopmental differences, and those at risk of exclusion, and a particular focus on children who are looked after. And, it was just to highlight that and sort of offer the opportunity to bring back a report with more detail around the EST team once they've sort of been in post for an academic year. But I hope that there's enough information within the report and the appendices, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rowan, and that's, again, very helpful to the key points read out. The ELSA acronym is explained in the report as Emotional Literacy Support Assistant, for anybody who may be less familiar with the acronym. And just looking for any points or questions, and whilst I'm waiting for that, one or two thoughts. It was very interesting how in 3.1 we identify the aims behind the work in the report as being set out in the Community and Corporate Plan, quotes, to develop and achieve a truly inclusive educational system and, quotes, reduce levels of exclusion, which would appear to be absolutely approaches that any reasonable person would wish to buy into. But it says nothing about achievement, it says nothing about attainment or reaching potential or even enjoyment. And I just wonder if we've got the balance right between those things, because presumably those aspects matter in many ways a great deal more. Be interested in your thoughts on that. But I see some hands going up, so I'll hold my other question, and perhaps we'll come back to that one, Marina. We'll ask colleagues who've now got their hands up. So, Councillor Buckler.
Thank you, Chair, very much, and thank you very much, Morwenna, for your report. I have a couple of questions. What is the common ground and connection between vulnerable learners and additional learning provision? And also, does the funding link as well? And you cite children having suffered traumatic childhood experiences and the training offered. And does this include parents and carers? And what is the practical provision that enables children to build a resilience, which I think is incredibly important in the face of traumatic childhood experiences, so that they can cope with life as young adults and beyond? Because obviously, not only does it have an effect on the children themselves, but it has an effect on society as a whole. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler. And Marina.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Buckler. The language of vulnerable learners is one that is used by Estin as an example, and they talk about vulnerable groups, and that one of their vulnerable groups, there are many, as I'm sure you can imagine, one of their vulnerable groups includes children with additional learning needs. So when you asked about the link between vulnerable learners and additional learning provision, for a child to have an additional learning need under the new legislation, they have to have a need that requires an additional learning provision. That's the definition, so something different to or extra that requires an additional learning provision. So we have the ALN code talks about universal provision, which is what should be available to all children, which includes differentiation as an example to meet the needs of different levels of attainment. Then in Monmouthshire we have a layer called Universal Plus that sits on top of that, and that's what we would class as reasonable adjustments for children. So again, within kind of broad universal provision within a school, a child would not necessarily have an ALN, they would have a barrier to learning, and that would be met through a reasonable adjustment, which would be highlighted through their one-page profile and targets, so some targets related to that around their specific needs. For children to have an ALN, they require that ALP, so that additional learning provision. So that again is we move up the triangle. I'm using my hands to define a triangle, and as we move up the triangle, their needs become more complex and they require greater level of provision. So there is a link, but it isn't linked to funding because our funding is delegated to our schools. Our additional learning needs funding is delegated to our schools. So the schools hold the money based on the number of children they report in, I'm going to say, January, February, around their PLASC data, and that determines how much money the schools get of the delegated ALM budget. So this provision is not linked to additional funding. This is support service provision, external provision that goes into all of our, is an offer for all of our schools, and it's based on needs, it's needs-led. So I hope that answers your first question. The second question, trauma-informed work, as you say, highlights that approach, that relational approach to children and young people who've experienced trauma. And I could go on for hours about that as a psychologist, but ultimately trauma can be anything relating from something very obvious and traumatic, and I'm going to give an example. A pandemic would be one that we've all lived through to, you know, loss and bereavement that might be very individualised and very kind of personal. So trauma isn't something that we can judge, and we talk about relational practice in that sense of it's all about the relationships. To make somebody feel safe and secure in an emotional sense, it's about relationships. So whether that extends to parents and carers, absolutely. That is a strand of the work that we're exploring at the moment, and we're working closely with partners within the health sector, so the Cynefin team, which are a whole school approaches team of psychologists who sit within health, but we have a foot in our team because we've actually got colleagues who work across both teams. So they're developing some work alongside CAMS InReach, so child and adolescent mental health services InReach teams. So we're all working together as part of the working group and as part of the steering group to look at how we can work to support parents and carers of children who have had these experiences. So we talk about trauma, or we talk about ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences. It's a real challenge at the moment because there is a lot of need out there, but that is absolutely a thread of the work that we are hoping to bring through the working group as we move forward, and are supporting schools to work with those parents and carers who may require or may request additional support. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And Councillor Buckler, was there any brief point that you wanted to come back on in that?
I'd just like to reiterate, really, my point of resilience in the future for the children. You know, what, you know, have you got strategies because to cope, to enable them to cope in the future, because it's critical, isn't it, that our generation that have been suffering so much, that they are able to cope, because it helps all of us in society, let alone the young people involved.
Yes, apologies, Councillor Buckler, I'd forgotten that element. Absolutely, I think the evidence base for relational approaches, trauma-informed approaches, as well as for ELSA, so Emotional Literacy Support System, is very strong because it identifies that if we get in early at that lower level, preventative, universal kind of level of support, that we can absolutely build that resilience, build that sense of sort of emotional safety and security, and give young people strategies to cope into their later lives. There is, a focus for Monmouthshire and inclusion in particular to try and intervene as early as possible. And absolutely that is about, so ELSA as a specific intervention around an individual would be about having a number of sessions to build strategies, coping strategies that would absolutely target resilience, self-esteem, motivation, social skills, whatever the area of need is. And I absolutely agree with you. This is about creating children who are resilient, able to cope under stress, the normal stresses and strains of life, let alone some of the experiences that some of our young people are, having to go through, and giving them the tools to navigate successfully, we hope, an educational experience and come out the other end as a kind of, a contributor, a well-balanced, happy individual who's able to go and sort of find their purpose and contribute in some way towards their community and society. So absolutely the focus of both the trauma-informed approaches, but the ELSA approaches, as well as the work that the EST team are doing and the specialist teaching service, is all about understanding individual need and then building that sense of resilience and confidence and self-esteem that is needed to help children and young people to cope with life, which is tough at times. So yeah, absolutely. And I would, yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
hope I've answered that
and
question.
Will.
Thank you, Chair. And just to build on Mowena's really full answer, the other point is that these are services that we provide into schools, advice and training, but they are for children who are typically in those upper tiers in terms of their levels of need. But just to be really clear, the 4 purposes of the curriculum which our schools deliver, and so there is a really important function for our schools in being the service that our children engage with on a day-to-day basis. One of the 4 purposes of the curriculum is to allow our children to become healthy, confident individuals who, and one of the key ones there to Councillor Buckler's points, are building their mental and emotional well-being by developing confidence, resilience and empathy. So this is hardwired into the way that in which our curriculum is constructed. It's really important that we all understand that how our local schools design and implement that curriculum is entirely to their own local context, but that is one of the key principles in that, the 4 purposes of the curriculum for Wales. So I think it's understanding that's the base that we're building off, and the intervention that Mowen has spoken to about how we add and secure additional value for those children who need a little bit more as they go through those periods of time in their lives where as inevitably everybody does.
Thank you. Moving on to Councillor Strong.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very interesting report about really important work. Obviously, COVID has enhanced the importance of it, but I was very interested to see that it sort of started back in 2016. If I could sort of put in a bit of a personal observation before I ask a question, I retired from teaching 10 years ago, but then came back to the same comprehensive school in Monmouthshire and worked for several years as an exam supervisor. And it was increasingly apparent to me the sort of care that was being taken with vulnerable learners to allow them to take their exams in the best conditions possible. So, for example, some of them would sit in small bases rather than the huge gymnasiums or whatever. They would be allowed short breaks during the period of the exam, even allowed to sit in a particular place in the room. And they were all important points, and many of them relied heavily on the TAs to inform us and help the exam officers to implement that. So it was a very, I think, positive approach to things. What I want to ask, though, is emotional literacy and the sort of things we're dealing with here are not easy things to measure. You talked about it being evidence-based and so on. But do we accept that to an extent you cannot measure the effectiveness of these schemes, and perhaps a bit more on what criteria you do use, insofar as it's possible to do so, to measure the effectiveness of the TAs and the other workers in this field?
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you for your question, Councillor Strong. And absolutely, I think that focus on kind of individual needs for accessing exam is a really good example of how we are much getting better at. There's always room for improvement in meeting those needs of increasing range of vulnerable learners within our schools. You're right, emotional literacy is really difficult to measure, and sometimes you don't know, because the outcome is that the child is more resilient, so that actually, you don't hear from them anymore. They've succeeded in the intervention. So it is really difficult. I think at the moment, particularly with the ELSA, we're exploring that all the time. It's a school-based intervention. So our schools, as Will highlighted earlier, as well as developing their own curriculum for their children, they would develop their models of sort of the monitoring of impact around ELSA, as an example. We're looking at a local authority, which elements of that we could hold and gather, and whether it's a right for us to hold and gather those across a local authority level. So we're continuing to explore that, and we explore that through our supervision groups that happen once every half term. So just looking at how do we know if it's been impactful. Very often it's pupil voice, it's parent feedback, it's a sense of, are they feeling more confident, are they happier coming to school. It does have an impact on things like attendance and engagement with learning, and again, those are things that are very much monitored at a school-based level rather than a local authority-based level. In terms of kind of the evidence base around it, there are ELSA, and I'm taking, but it's the same for trauma-informed. There is a really robust international for trauma-informed, but national evidence base around the programmes. And actually within Monmouthshire, on 3 occasions, we've had in-depth pieces of work carried out around our ELSA model by trainee doctoral students on the educational psychology course in Cardiff University. And again, they're linked in, I know, at the back of the report, but we had a piece of work that was exploring head teachers' perceptions of ELSA and the effectiveness, pupil perceptions, and then a third piece around teachers' perceptions. So we've looked at it at the different points of view. And very often it is around getting that more qualitative feedback around, because it's all around feelings, recognising feelings and understanding, do they have coping strategies? Do they have a sense of resilience or well-being? It is very difficult to measure. There are measures out there which we utilise, and we encourage schools to utilise as well. There are sort of, standardised measures around emotional literacy and emotional kind of resilience that can be measured, and we also do quite a lot of pre and post with ELSA. We expect them to do a kind of a pre-measure and a post-measure in terms of confidence, depending on the area being targeted. But it is a very difficult one to measure, and it is hard to pin down really at times. But pupil voice is very important for us. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, look, that's fine. I'm going to put a heavy emphasis on qualitative rather than just quantitative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds as much assessment as measurement, which is very, very challenging. Councillor McConnell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for this. Really, I really do welcome this report and the work that's gone into it. Excuse me. I'm picking up slightly from Councillor Butler's question, and I'm thinking particularly of those children at the top end of that triangle, I think. So in trauma-informed practice, one of the bits of evidence that comes out from that's in that evidence space is that trauma is often experienced by a family, not just a child, picking up from Councillor Butler's point. But there are risks of trauma being revisited or approached in different settings. So I'm thinking particularly where different agencies are involved. Health has been mentioned as being very much part of this and knitting in together. Because where different agencies are involved, different policies and different theoretical bases can come into play, and that at worst can be damaging, and at better can be straightforwardly confusing for the people involved. And there's also danger of repeating, having to repeat your story in different settings, which can re-traumatise. So I'm just wondering about what links there are made at the strategic level and at the practice level between different agencies. So I'm thinking, we mentioned health, but social services are frequently involved in situations where there's family or individual childhood trauma, and also sadly youth offending teams and the police will also be involved quite often in these sorts of situations. So my question really is about the strategic and practice level link-ups? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McConnell.
I'll try and answer your question. Thank you, Councillor McConnell. So, yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. Very often, a trauma is experienced by a family, and so that those interlinks between education and other agencies are really key. I think at a kind of a practical school-based operational level, the ALN code, but our practice in schools in general, so not just for those children who've got that recognised ALN, but all the way through, we talk about person-centred practice, and that is something that's replicated both in health and social care. And that's around putting the child and their family, key, at the centre of those discussions when both identifying need but considering provision or intervention that might be appropriate. So we would advocate, and that's part of the, the earlier piece around that quality assurance around ALN in general, we would advocate that all of our schools and settings work in person-centred practice manner. So child's voice, parent or carer voice is really key. And any other key agency. So for example, if social care are involved, we would expect them to be part of that, as well as youth offending service as an example. That's not dictated in here, but other training, we develop a lot of training around vulnerable learners, and that is offered out not just to education but to social care, education, welfare, youth offending service, and we've had really good uptake of that. So we do have that kind of strategic link in, and we have networks where we welcome those agencies in to come and speak to our educational practitioners, our staff in schools as well. I guess at a strategic level, there are a number of pieces of work that come either from health or from education, but have those links in. And the same with social care, really. I think at a local level, I'm increasingly working with our social care colleagues to, sit across key pieces of work. For example, children looked after, which is an obvious trauma, children who've been, removed from birth families. We have a CLAR network, children looked after network, where our designated leads from our schools attend, but social care attend that as well, to kind of ensure that we have the same ideas, the same language, the same approaches. We would always look to try and do that in a person-centred way, which would mean to do it once, where possible, for a family, so that you would have the right people at the meeting, not have to do multiple meetings. But just to kind of reiterate, the trauma-informed approaches aren't therapy, they are just approaches, relational approaches, which ultimately identify how important those relationships are for children and families to feel reassured that their needs are being met, that their child is understood, and that people are doing the best in their capacity to kind of meet those presenting needs. And we'll listen when they get it wrong and tweak it. But so I hope that there's a reassurance in that strategic. There's always more that we can do, and we're always looking for opportunities to link up and connect and invite people into what we're doing and to share our good practice. So we will continue to do that. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's both ends, and we are trying to tackle it at both ends. And obviously, for example, the trauma-informed work, we've got a working group, and that includes, we've got health representation, but we've also got school-based counselling sit on that, and they're part of social care in Monmouthshire. So we do have those other kind of links in, both at a local and a kind of more regional level. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And moving on to Councillor Pavia.
Yeah, thanks. And can I thank Councillor Wagstaff, Dr. Wagstaff, for a paper again. Really important that trauma-informed approaches and embedding that in our schools. And Dr. Wagstaff said about the supporting children and young people post-pandemic. I'm a governor in a primary school in Shepstone that's had a significant influx of Ukrainian children over the last 18 months, 2 years. We're really, really privileged to have those children with us. But having these approaches to settle those children into a very new community is really, really important. And we've been really benefited from that, and particularly ELSA training as well for our teaching assistants. And I suppose it's that element that I just want to focus on. And Dr. Wagstaff said about the risks about that workforce, and we know the pressures on schools' budgets, and potentially, I suppose redundancy positions in various schools moving forward, where those decisions have to be taken. I suppose we're investing time and money and supporting those members of staff with the training. I know from where those members of staff in my particular primary school have been absolutely invaluable. There's a strong relationship built with the children, but I suppose there's a sort of Damocles hanging over their heads potentially because of the financial position. So how could we mitigate that? Because we're investing that resource in them. They're providing really, really invaluable support, yet their tenure could be under threat, and that loss of resource to school, potentially to the whole county. If they move to a different schooling provision in another local authority, then that's a loss to us. So are there ways we can potentially look to mitigate that in terms of sharing best practice? I know those individuals need to go on specific training, but trying to embed those those best practice qualities across the school to I suppose mitigate some of the loss if they have to go because of the financial constraints that are on a particular school.
Thank you, Councillor Pavia.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Pavia, and I am really pleased to hear that the support for the Ukrainian young people in the school has been well received. Absolutely, that is a real risk for us at the moment, the population of teaching assistants, and it's always quite a dynamic population anyway, because that often they move or have a different role in school. So that is why the ELSA programme, being a kind of a cyclical thing, is really key for us, because we try and catch new and reinforce that. I think to try and provide some information about mitigation, I would highlight the Welsh Government's statutory framework around whole school approaches to emotional health and well-being. And that is obviously being driven by another member of my service, the Healthy Settings Service, in terms of that implementation and that uptake of that. I think both the trauma-informed practice, that relational approach that we're trying to encourage all schools to adopt, alongside that general understanding of emotional literacy, it should be whole school. To quote the ALN, we're all teachers of ALN. All teachers are teachers of ALN. The same with our vulnerable groups. We need to embed that as a whole school approach, and that's what the Welsh Government expect us to do. And I think where both the ELSA and the trauma-informed work and the work of the EST team, the Education Support Team, are about supporting schools to do that, to ensure that they have looked at their processes, that they have their so that they're skilling up their whole workforce. That's not to say that they can provide that kind of individual intervention akin to an ELSA, because obviously that's a 6-day training. But part of the work that we're exploring as the working group, the trauma-informed practice working group, is looking at whether we can provide a midpoint training for more staff, so not the 6-day whole ELSA training and then you have to practice as an ELSA and be supervised, but that we could offer training for teachers around kind of managing emotional literacy, looking at the link into behaviours of concern and challenge, and giving real strategies. And that's why really we put those in one report, because there is a real interconnectedness between those approaches. I see the kind of trauma-informed, the relational approaches, as the kind of umbrella that sits across it all and is a way of tying into the expectation of Welsh Government that we have a whole school approach to mental health and well-being within all of our settings and schools, and that's our obligation. So in a way, although some of these approaches have been in Monmouthshire for a number of years, that's given us the reason now to go into our schools and kind of ask them questions and to support them to ensure that this becomes a whole school approach to meeting the needs of a range of learners who may and do present with emotional health and wellbeing difficulties. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, and it's worth, I suppose, mentioning the fairly clear concern that the most recent estimate is that there are 16 schools in Monmouthshire moving into deficit this year. that is in the most recent month 9 report, and the pretty clear concern that in trying to manage their deficits, there is going to be, as we've seen in so many schools across South Wales, let alone other parts of Wales, cutbacks in staff, and that very often starts with those teaching assistants who are most in need to support the young people who have got particular learning needs. So it's potentially a very much more serious situation moving forward, given what we know about the deficit position. But thank you for that. I'm going to move on to Councillor Webb.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wagstaff. Amazing amount of information in both papers. Thank you so much, and give our thanks to all those who put them together. You actually mentioned when you were speaking about the waiting list under the risk section. This is for the first time, you've said. I imagine it's due to staffing and funding, but how big is this waiting list? If you can't tell us now, perhaps you could send us information later. But it does seem as it's for the first time that it was you were concerned about this.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Webb. Yeah, so the waiting list is with regards to the specialist teaching service, so who's particularly support children with literacy difficulties. It's a small waiting list. Unfortunately, I couldn't tell you exactly how many are on it at the moment. And I think we are looking how we're going to manage that is around the referrals in for individual support for that team come through a panel, and so that's prioritised in terms of kind of need and things like that. And also the model of delivery for the specialist teaching service now is a very kind of time limited block of intervention, so it's typically 10 to 12 sessions, which does mean that we can, there isn't, it's not an end, they don't have to wait forever, so it would be a short period of time, hopefully, that they would wait before that they would get that individual input. All of our primary schools have a link specialist teaching service member of staff linked to them, so they have a named person, so that there are opportunities outside of providing that individualised direct teaching to just request support or guidance in the interim around the waiting list. I think that's something that we need to keep a close eye on in terms of numbers and how we manage that, because alongside the providing the individualised intervention support for individual children, there is that strand of work that's ongoing around the preventative work, the building capacity, so they're going into school and training teaching assistants, but also teachers around their approaches to literacy. So those two things need to go hand in hand, and what we don't want to do is stop the one around building capacities in schools and giving schools the confidence to meet these children's needs themselves, because we're managing a waiting list. So it is a new thing for us to have that waiting list, but I think what we probably need to do over the next few terms is monitor that and manage that, and perhaps if I come back again I could bring you an update on how that feels over kind of the course of a number of terms, because at the moment that is early days. I'm confident that we'll manage that quite well and children won't have to wait for a very long period of time, but that is about us just managing that really and those expectations. But I will put that down as something to bring back.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And finally, Councillor Howells.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Wagstaff, for bringing this review. Just really, I see one of the identified risks is the reliance on grant funding. So I was just wondering whether or not how you're doing with that, really, and have you secured funding for how many ongoing years? And off the back of that, sort of with resources, with educational psychologists, do you have enough? I'm sure you could always do with more. And what else did I have? I was interested to see the figure of 500 of the MCC staff have access to the whole staff training. That seems a large number. Is it pretty much all our teaching staff have undergone that training? Just those three items. Thanks.
Thank you.
To do is utilise that grant in a way that is going to make it sustainable going forward. So and that's why we're trying to bring the trauma-informed practice into an in-house training model as an example, so that through the educational psychology service and some of the other support services that sit in my arena, and school-in staff who have that level of training, because some of the people with those diplomas sit within our schools, not in the local authority, we can kind of continue to drive that forward should the grant funding cease. I don't think there's an indication at the moment that that is the case, but I think we tend to go year on year with Welsh Government grant funding. So with the trauma-informed. In terms of the ELSA model, we, a few years ago, reluctantly started charging our schools for that. Prior to that, it had always been free. We did that because actually as the numbers of ELSAs increase, the demand of supervision increases as well for the psychology service, and we just had to ensure that we could manage that into the future. And actually that didn't affect the numbers that we've received training, and I think in a way it ensures that schools are really behind it to deliver it. So in terms of the ELSA, that's less of a threat. And both the education support team and the specialist teaching team have a budget built in at the moment. At the moment, that is to remain. In terms of educational psychology service, and that is a report I hope to bring to this group at some future point, we're really fortunate in Monmouthshire in that we have a healthy educational psychology service, and we have recruited and retained psychologists really well. That's not the case for regional partners or national. Picture is fairly bleak in some areas of Wales in particular. They can't get educational psychologists. And that is a credit to the team that we have and the range of work that they get to do. They do preventative capacity building, and as you've heard today, a number of different and interesting projects that means that people want to work with us and they can really see the impact of the difference they're making. It's not just kind of that response to statutory duties. So at the moment we are a healthy service, but we need to maintain that. And again, we look at using the grants when necessary to support some of the project work that's going through and to prioritise some of that. In answer to your question around the 500 staff that have accessed the trauma-informed schools training, I don't think that is all of our teaching staff, and I would love it we would get to the point where we've got all of our teaching staff, and I think that will reflect that we've got different layers to that training. So we've got the diploma, which is the 10-day kind of intense training. We've got a 2-day senior leaders programme that lots of school-based staff, but also local authorities officers have access. And then we have a whole school training, which currently is as a webinar. We've bought the webinar so that whole schools can use that as part of an inset, as an example, or a training day, or they can ask their staff to access that. And then what we offer behind that is they can then request that educational psychologists or some members of the team could go in and then do a bespoke kind of follow-up session to that webinar, question and answers, or develop any elements of that further. We're very reflective and flexible in the way that we offer that training. So, for example, we've gone into all of our secondary schools and delivered that quite a bespoke way to small groups of staff who are kind of the key players. So we would love to get to the point where all of our schools and all of our staff have accessed that, but we're not there yet. But it will become, as I say, that umbrella that, you know, I keep banging on about it, and we keep layering that training, not just through this one trauma-informed approach, but it actually knits through so many of our other approaches that actually it just becomes part and parcel, hopefully, to that kind of notion of a whole school approach to emotional and mental health within all of our schools. So I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you. Yeah, no, very positive to hear that feedback. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marwan. And that's going to conclude our questions on this particular report. And it's just to really reiterate and emphasise how strongly I think the committee supports the work that is carried out by all our own staff, and be very grateful if you could pass that back, Marwana. But also to all the staff in all the schools that carry out such critically important work, you know, building citizens for the future and trying to ensure that young people have the best chances in their lives despite whatever difficulties and traumas they may have experienced in their early lives. So fantastic work that goes on a day-to-day basis. And we're going to take a break at that point. And thank you, Marina, for your responses, and to Councillor Grocott for being here as well. We'll take a 5-minute break. And we'll start again. We'll finish at 12. We'll be aiming to finish by 12:30. So we'll take the break and then start again in 5 minutes. Okay. Fantastic. Great. So we're just going to kick off in a minute. We're not started again yet, have we?
I've turned that off.
Yeah. Just to explain, we're going to, in terms of risk register, we've got with us, as you probably can see, is Richard Jones, the Performance Data Insight Manager, and Hannah Carter, the Performance Analyst. And we're not going to, we don't have all cabinet members, we don't have all chief officers, because the risk register covers just the whole span of the organisation in many different ways. So we're going to, I'm going to ask you to home in, aim to home in on those areas of greatest concern, which are likely to be those with the highest score pre and post mitigation, and those areas that you might query the scoring. You might say the scoring looks high or low. We'll aim to feed back to the cabinet members ahead of it that's going to cabinet in a couple of weeks, and just the areas of greatest concern. And we'll aim to build in to the forward work programme particular focus on any of the particular risk areas that you and we have a main interest in. So we're not going to go through one by one, but by all means, please do pick out 2 or 3 areas that from your perspective are of greatest concern. Would that be all right, everybody online too? Great. It would be a little unreasonable to expect Richard and Hannah to respond in detail to every single question on every single risk. I think that's something we can all recognise. Okay, so we're going to recommence the performance and overview scrutiny, and we're moving on to item 6, which is the risk register update. And we welcome Richard Jones, the Performance and Data Insight Manager, and Hannah Carter, the Performance Analyst. We will not, in this particular report, go into every single item on the risk register, which is many dozens of individual items. We're going to do this by exception, where we're identifying those areas of greatest interest or concern to the committee, and they're likely to be those areas with the highest score of likelihood and impact before mitigation action has been taken, as set out in the report, and also where there is still a high level of scoring after mitigation. So we're going to particularly focus on those and on any particular areas that committee members may have some question about whether we've got the scoring right. It might be too high or too low in their view. And we'll build into the forward work plan some further time in which we can actually delve into some of this in more detail. So thank you for that. We'll move on to the report. And Richard, would you be able to just overview it for us, and then we'll move into it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and good morning, members. So be familiar, hopefully now, with the risk register itself. It's part of our regular 6-monthly reporting to you as a committee. It covers strategic risks facing the organisation. Strategic risks are typically those risks which jeopardise the council's ability to deliver our objectives, statutory plans or services as we intended. The strategic risk assessment ensures that strategic risks are identified and monitored by the authority. Risk controls are put in place and they're appropriate and proportionate, and that senior managers, elected members and those responsible for managing and mitigating the risks review them and keep them up to date. The risk assessment only covers high and medium level strategic risks. Lower level or other operational risks are managed through a variety of other arrangements. The strategic risk assessment is regularly updated in line with the latest evidence that the Council receives. We're conscious it is a detailed document, as you alluded to, Chair. We've tried to provide a summary at the start of Appendix 1 to capture some of the key changes to the risks, the risk levels, and also an update on some of the key progress with mitigating actions, particularly in the last 6 months since the committee saw the report. Finally, just to draw the committee's attention that we are and have undertaken a review of our risk management policy and guidance that underpins how we manage and identify strategic risks. That has been presented to Governance and Audit Committee in line with their remit to seek assurance about the effectiveness of our risk management arrangements, and that, along with this strategic risk register, will go for formal approval for Cabinet in June. I think it's important to emphasise that, because the next time you see this report, you'll see that the risk register itself would evolve. The aim of reviewing our policy is to strengthen our risk identification arrangements, improve how we manage and monitor risks, and also define our risk appetite. So the next report, whilst there'll be a continuity in terms of risk identified, we will be looking to implement, subject to that agreement by Cabinet in June, the policy that will develop the structure of the risk register the next time you see it in your 6-monthly reporting. So Hannah and I are happy to take any questions, and Chair, as you rightly said, hopefully this report can inform your future work programme as a committee where you feel there are risks that you would like to understand or go into in more detail.
Thank you, Richard, and we'll move into questions that committee members may have, and I'll look for hands as they go up. And whilst I'm waiting for I'll just mention the first that I've noted down here. Risk number 2, some services to become financially unsustainable. That is such a broad and immediate risk to the authority in many different ways, and it remains extremely high in the scoring both before and after mitigation. So that's, I think, something that I won't be surprised if colleagues have got a similar concern as to what further mitigation might be necessary to reduce the risk of something that is still declared as extremely high after mitigation of that nature. Councillor Buckler, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Point 2 is top of my hit parade. It feels a bit like a holding pattern. I absolutely appreciate, Richard and Hannah, that you bring these risk factors to us. But, you know, we can't really delve into things with you until we have the cabinet members and the lead officers in front of us. But risk number 2, you know, some services will become financially unsustainable. You know, which services are of particular concern? Because obviously, you know, that's a broad sweeping statement, but, you know, that leapt out at me as it did with the chair, of course. And number 6, there's a medium risk to significant harm to a child or adult due to a specific failure of safeguarding arrangements. As we know, that there is, in fact, a significant gap in the monitoring and follow-up visits to children, which has been reported very recently, that are at risk in one form or another. You know, but the mitigation is, when the risk is mitigated, the score is still 8 high. So what on earth are the measures being put in place to solve this really real risk? Because one child is more vulnerable than services, say, you know, not collecting the bins on time. So, you know, very important. And number 9, high absence rates, particularly in vulnerable children. The mitigation has been updated. However, again, the risk remains at exactly the same level. And we know what sort of problems can occur, family-oriented, child-oriented, and society from this problem of high absence rate. So it doesn't look as though the progress will be made. So can we have that explained? Thank you.
Councillor Buckler, it's an interesting aspect of this. The earlier reports we were looking at in terms of ALN and supporting vulnerable learners, the connection that appears to be there in what we've looked at previously at performance and overview, which is this extraordinarily high absence level in schools for whatever reason, the difficulty that some young people have got in engaging with learning in different ways. there may be a link, there may not, but it would appear in the face of it that that is a link. So it's very clearly a real concern. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's not going to be possible for us to ask Richard to explain this, but we will want to do follow-up on this. So we will, Hazel is noting down our questions, which we'll pass to Cabinet members, and we will home in on follow-up work with regard to some of these areas when we conclude after we conclude the meeting. I realise that you will recognise we can't just imagine what the responses will be. We need to try and make sure we get some clear responses as to what need to be very important questions. So, Richard, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to the points that have been raised by Councillor Buckler.
Yeah, I think just in terms of the process we go through to both update, assess and update the risk register, and also some of the changes we're proposing as part of the risk management policy review, which may help clarify further understanding about why we've come to conclusion about the risk levels currently and the progress of mitigating actions. So in setting the risks, we've got the risk scoring matrix. You'll see in Appendix 2 that we ask risk owners to assess the current nature of their risk against and how they see the risk being mitigated so far with the present progress of mitigating actions in place. As you can understand, and as Councillor Buckler's helpfully alluded to, that there's a range of complex issues that underpin some of these strategic risks. They're often not just one issue, there's a combination of range of factors. Some of those factors will be more directly within the Council's control and how they mitigate. Some might be wider societal factors which may be presenting, particularly within the Council, within Monmouthshire, that the council doesn't have direct or direct control over. So we have to factor all that into our assessment of the risk. In terms of the changes proposed in future, one of the things we're looking to include is a clear assessment of how we're managing, how we intend to manage the risk. So I'll look at whether we're going to things like, are we aiming to treat the risk? Are we aiming to tolerate the risk? Are we aiming to transfer the risk? Are we aiming to terminate the risk? So that should give a clear understanding to any reader of the risk register, our intended approach to how we're managing the risk. And equally, we're also going to look to try and assess target risk scores. So that should give you that journey of what the risk is with no mitigating action, what the risk is where we currently are with our current proposed mitigating actions, and then our target risk is where we think we want to get the risk level down to, and that will be proportionally assessed. Some of these, unfortunately, will probably not go to low risk because of the nature of the complex issues that underpin them, but as a council, that would hopefully more clearly identify where we're trying to get the risk level down to and make it more informative for the reader who picks this up to understand where we are on that journey, which I think alludes to some of the questions about why aren't risk levels changing. So that sort of plans for the future, but I do think it's important to say those risks have been assessed by those risk owners. There's some challenge in the process to make sure that they're fair, and also it's a balance, because obviously you want to be transparent and honest in that assessment as well, in making sure that both risks aren't over-assessed but equally aren't under-assessed if we don't feel that progress is being made to mitigating them to that level. And that's a challenge and balance that Hannah and I, along with other colleagues in the process, will provide along with those risk owners.
Thank you, Richard. I think one of the behind some of this, and Councillor Buckler, this may well be something you would want to comment on, is when this is presented as standard text and there isn't any variation between those risks which, as have been itemised 7 and 8, for example, in regard to potential harm to vulnerable children, and an 8 to meet the care and support needs of some vulnerable adults, if that is shown as high after mitigation, this becomes a dashboard, and really what I would have thought we would want to see is, at the very least, colour highlighting of something which is an increased concern. And surely it is for the whole local authority. a significant concern if we're saying that after mitigation has been applied, the scoring by the officers of the services to vulnerable young people and vulnerable adults has a high risk of likelihood and impact. And I would expect that that would be very strongly highlighted so that we're picking that out, and it's, the dashboard is screaming out here, watch out here, you've got to make sure you address this issue. As it is, it sort of sits there in standard text in black and white, font sized 11 or 8 or whatever it is, and it has no variation between that and any other point, but they stand out to me as extraordinarily important. But I'm adding that to your point, Councillor Buckler. You may or may not have agreed with that, but is there anything else that you wanted to add before I move on to Councillor Howells?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Richard, thank you for your explanation. But, as the Chair has just said, the sort of the bold facts, you look at high risk continues to be high risk after mitigation. And obviously, we want solutions. We want to know that, that the solutions are there that can make these things better. So it does feel a bit frustrating for us as a committee member, that we can't sort of progress this now. But I do take your point about how it's all been put together. So thank you for that.
Okay, we'll move on to Councillor Howells.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Richard and Hannah. My concern is the number 11, the decarbonisation, really worrying on all those levels, at high at 16 for 2024, and then predicted highs as well, at the same level right through on all the next 2 years as well. So just, I belong to Together for the Climate group in USC, and I think we're all doing amazing work to benefit the climate, and I hear of other groups as well. It's a bit worrying to see that all we're doing is not having any effect in the risk factors. I might draw to your attention a couple of typos, really. On item 10 on the RLDP, you have the predicted mitigation after mitigation of 2026, 27 as medium, but on the page 62, you still have it as high. So, and also another one on the 14, which is the bus services. 2026 you're predicting as high 12, and then on page page 68 it's dropped to medium, which is 8, which is a bit more reassuring. So I think I'm all for improving the bus services. So just a little bit sort of the figures are a bit sort of not corresponding. But yeah, my main question was the decarbonisation and more the concern with that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Howells, and well spotted on those two items. We all had noticed those points. We just wanted to see if you'd noticed them. So thank you. No, I kid. Anyway, so your point is an extremely good one in terms of the decarbonisation. It's been still high, very high after mitigation. I think the clarity that we would want to see coming out of that is, are we saying that there is more we can do to mitigate, or are we saying we're going to lower the targets? Because it sits there as a sort of, well, that's the status, and we're going to rewrite an overarching review. But does that in real terms mean we're lowering the targets, we're changing the targets, or what does it mean? Because if it sits there as the highest rated risk of likelihood and impact after mitigation, it's another way of saying this is going to happen. We will fail to meet what's planned to be delivered. So it's just getting to that clarity. I think we'll try and pass that on to the Cabinet member as well. But yeah. Richard, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, because you can't respond to each of these points themselves.
I think Councillor for pointing out those scorings, we'll amend those. It is a live risk register. It's changing all the time, and I think that demonstrates it. Thank you for pointing those out. And yeah, I think obviously we've updated around risk 11, the work that's been done to rework the climate emergency strategy and the related action plans that underpin it. And I think the nature of the risk and the risk level will need to be assessed, aligned to the progress that is then made against that strategy as a key mitigating action. As well.
I think it's that clarity that we're going to see we can press for. I mean, either we take further action to achieve the aims that have been set out, or we're recognising these aims are not going to be achieved, in which case what's going to happen? But you know, this sort of the obfuscation route doesn't really work, does it? Councillor Howes, was there anything more that you wanted to add on that point? We'll pass that through to the Cabinet Member.
Thank you, Chair.
And Councillor Pavia. Yeah, thanks, Chair. Sorry, bring my microphone down. Yeah. Yeah, just in terms of item 1 or risk 1, which obviously has a knock-on implication for all the others, really. I'm just finding it inconsistent that we have a lower risk of delivering elements of the corporate plan, considering when you look at all the elements within the risk register, it's littered with references about present financial situation, future budget projection, demand and capacity pressures on social care for both adults and children. It seems illogical to me that we've gone from high to medium in terms of delivering on the corporate plan. I mean, it feels to me as we move through this year towards the back end of the year, we'll be over halfway through this term, that there's going to be the need for some sort of reprioritisation of the corporate plan to be presented to full council. Again, there's elements there of not being potentially reducing services because of financial pressures. It feels that drop, that score drop doesn't feel right to me. So if that could be fed back, please, Richard. And I'm sure there'll be elements that will be emerging. As you said, it is a live plan. Risk item 7 references the potential complications or consequences of the implementation of the removal of profit from children's services. And I think there's going to be a formal sort of announcement with legislation next week from Welsh Government. So I expect that to be a potentially formal risk on its own right, or to have implications on the risks that are there for children's services. Similarly, not there, and I'm sure will emerge, is the replacement for the Welsh Community Care Information System, which needs to happen within the next sort of 12 to 18 months. Again, potentially significant risk, costly risk for the authority, but I'm sure that will emerge. So thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Pavia. And I think the point you make was one that again we will feed that back. And it's this overall issue, I think, that councillors are making, which is the concern of what the overall dashboard of risk is telling us. It looks to me to be 8 of the 16 items that are shown here are at a level of high risk after mitigation. So half of the very serious risk areas, because we're talking about the fundamentals of the ability to be able to deliver services, that they are adjudged by the officers to be at a high level of risk after mitigation. Half of them, this is a dashboard that's screaming out at us of real health warnings. And what it doesn't seem to do is then say, so urgent action is being taken to address this by doing the following. It just seems to sit there waiting for the next risk assessment, which presumably is going to say the same thing, which is a real concern. Yeah, one of the areas I was just going to add, a couple of them, risk 7 which is about the challenges of children at risk, I thought it was very, very interesting to note the officer's comment that the challenges of children at risk, quotes, are likely to be exacerbated by Welsh Government policy commitment to eliminate profit from the care of looked after children, which could lead to instability in the market. I thought that was pretty extraordinary that our report is indicating that the policies that are being played out are actually likely to exacerbate the challenges for children at risk. How extraordinary is that? Risk 8, which is about vulnerable adults, about the risk of causing delays in service provision. And some people are having to wait for services to meet their assessed needs. So, clearly amongst the vulnerable older population, delays in meeting their assessed needs can be extremely important. They can lead to early hospitalisation, they can lead to early interventions, health interventions, as opposed to social care interventions that might otherwise be avoided. And in many ways, we will never know that, because what we're simply hearing is causing delays, quotes, in service provision, quotes, some people are having to wait for services to meet their assessed needs. So there isn't any reference to what has occurred or what is occurring due to those delays that have been caused. I'm not sure we're even particularly monitoring that, but it's clearly got to be a concern. So we'll feed those points back to the Cabinet, and I'll be in contact with you as members of the committee to see which areas you'd like to perhaps deep dive into over the forward plan, so we could actually really get to grips with some of these issues, because they are, on the face of it, they appear to be very fundamental. I don't know if there was any other comments or any other questions remaining from committee members. I don't see any. Richard, if you had any concluding points, you're very welcome to make them.
I think just reiterate what I said earlier, Chair, that obviously the risk assessment is a live document. It will get updated as new evidence comes to light, as things progress, and that obviously subject to that decision at Cabinet next week, the report you receive it in 6 months' time will be amended in line with that policy, and hopefully nature of the risk environment will be the nature of the risk environment at the time, but we'll be assessing it and hopefully making it clearer based on some of the points and the feedback from the committee about both where we are and where we are planning to be in our progress with mitigating risks. So I think hopefully that will help make it clearer for your scrutiny next time.
Thank you, Richard. And as there are no more questions or comments, I move the report that we have scrutinised the risk assessments, but we also are going to be following up on the issues and comments that have been raised by committee members, which do appear to be extremely important. And moving on to item 7, which is the Performance and Overview Future Work Programme. We can see that we'll actually in July be looking at the scrutiny of the self-assessment process, and it may be around there that we are able to do some follow-up work on this. But we'll weave into the forward work programme some follow-up areas that have been outstanding in the last half hour's discussion. And you will also see the action list from the meeting of the 19th of March. And I move on to item 8, which is a Cabinet and Council Work Planner, which you will be familiar with, but it will give you the plan for the year ahead. And on to item 9, which is minutes of the previous meeting of the 19th of March. Were there any comments or corrections from that, or do you move the report? Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, sorry, Hazel.
Just in terms of the work programme, Chair, Robert asked me to just advise you that you've got the Poverty Action Plan there for June, but we believe due to the sort of magnitude of your workload, possibly if you're in agreement, we could ask Place Scrutiny Committee to look at that at their next meeting in May, because they actually have an empty meeting. So.
Well, that might work very well, because we could then do a follow-up on some of these key areas that have emerged at this meeting, and we could follow up directly on that, so that would work very well.
Okay, and also that what might be of interest to you is on the 23rd of July, People's Scrutiny Committee have got the Care Inspectorate Wales inspection report. Now, it's up to you if you'd like to table that to your committee as well, but it sort of straddles both of your committees, or whether you would like an invite to that meeting on the 23rd of July.
Yeah, I'll put a note around colleagues, but we've had a joint meeting before on issues that straddle, and it may well be that would be a good one to do that very thing on. Perhaps we'll drop a note out, and I'm seeing some nodding heads, and suggest that we put an invite out on that basis. Yeah. Great, thank you, Hazel. And also thank you for covering today. I know Robert's done well, so much appreciate your working your way throughout. Thank you. Yes, so minutes of the previous meeting. I think we moved the report, and there were no other concerns on the meeting itself, the minutes. So the date of the next meeting is, can you believe it, we will be in summer, which means the rain will be warmer, I think. But the next meeting is on the 18th of June. Good to see you all again today. Thanks very much for your contributions, and thank you to Richard and Hannah. Thanks for your joining the meeting and for a summary of the reports. Thank you very much indeed. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Closed.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone.